Hello and good afternoon. Welcome. We're going to get started. Some people may be filtering in, but in the interest of time, my name is Fiona Miller. I'm an associate professor in the Institute of Health Policy Management and Evaluation at the University of Toronto, and I have the pleasure of both moderating and speaking in this panel. Thank you very much again for being here. So our goal today is to talk about assessing diagnostics, diagnostic innovation, and the role of HTA. So we're posing a question, whether we're seeing, or I'm posing a question, whether we're seeing a growth of high cost, high complexity, and high utilization diagnostics that might be prompting response from HTA to that. And so I'll start off by posing that question, and then I'll be followed by Dr. François Rousseau, who's a laboratory physician, a scientist, a professor at the University of Laval, and actually the chair of the INES Committee on Diagnostics. So for that's the Québec experience, and we'll turn to Dr. Irfan Dalla, the latest recipient of a much-deserved award, who's the Vice President of Evidence Development and Standards at Health Quality Ontario, and also a physician at St. Mike's. And then turn to Dr. Tanny Clifford, who's the Vice President, or he's the Chief Scientist and Vice President of Evidence Standards at CADTH for the CADTH experience in assessing diagnostic innovation. So I have no So the question, as I say, I want to pose is whether we're facing a growing challenge of blockbuster diagnostics. And this phrase has been coined by my colleague Hogarth from Cambridge University, and obviously the analogy is to drugs, high cost, highly profitable diagnostics that could be blockbusters for it. Is that happening? And we're all familiar with the high expectations, probably more familiar perhaps than we wish to be, with the high expectations about diagnostic innovation, particularly in the genomics and post-genomics space. So this is Francis Collins, the NIH director, and one of many such claims for transformative change in diagnostics that will lead to a revolution in the practice of medicine. And here he's specifically focused on sequencing. We will all apparently have our genome sequenced as part of our medical record within the next decade. So I'm counting. That was 2011. I'm not quite sure that's happening in the next 4 years. But those high expectations are there. Those expectations are also with industry for a broader vision and role for the diagnostics industry. Of course, diagnostics have always had a fundamentally important role in healthcare, but is there a greater role? So this is actually quite an old slide from Roche Diagnostics, but nonetheless characterizing a classic today model of diagnosis and monitoring to a tomorrow model that is more expansive. Risk prediction, early detection, therapy prediction, pharmacogenomics, and this is their vision of a role that they will play in, I think, what's being called sort of personalized precision medicine. So that's accompanied with a sense that there's a market, a growing global market for diagnostics companies to sell into. So part of what we may be seeing is a shift in business model within the diagnostics industry. So what's traditionally been a fairly low-cost product, high volume, low cost, those are the prices on your left, to, at least for some companies, a bigger, a more expensive set of tests that are able to be marketed. So higher price, higher uptake, and in the old business model where the intellectual property protection is quite limited or is on the platform technology, to a new business model where there could be IP in the biomarkers or in the algorithms for assessing them, so much stronger IP stance that companies can hold. So a couple of examples that are touching us in Canada as patients, as providers of care, as systems funding care. One that many of you will be familiar with is Oncotype Dx. So this is a gene expression test that's being used in the context of early stage breast cancer to help women or to inform decisions about whether or not the recurrence risk is sufficiently high to warrant using chemotherapy. And so that's been funded in Canada through most provinces, starting with Ontario in 2010. So a fairly big impact. I don't know what the exact numbers are, but media reports are certainly in the thousands of Canadian women who are using this test. And obviously Genomic Health, the company that markets this test, sees this as this and other tests like prostate as tremendous opportunities for continued growth, a $1.7 billion growth opportunity in their area of cancer diagnostics. Another example, non-invasive prenatal testing. Now this is a set of technologies and a science that's really, I think, quite radical in the prenatal testing and screening world, because it permits instead of invasively testing the fetus, one can actually collect material through maternal blood and so non-invasively assess the fetus. So these tests have been on the market globally since about 2011, fairly sizable market, multiple players here, and the coverage in Canada is more recent in terms of the coverage by public payers. In Ontario since 2015, these tests have been covered as a second-tier test, so women who are at higher risk. I think BC and François tells me Manitoba and Nova Scotia, but delighted to be updated and clarified on the coverage situation. So again, this is a company, one of them, Sequenom, which first mover here, sees this tremendous growth opportunity, currently significant coverage of high-risk pregnancies as we have through public payers in Canada, but moving into the average risk. So it was a first-tier test for women in the context of pregnancy, and then they have other products in the reproductive health space. So a big addressable market. So what's the problem? Is this a problem? We're seeing at least some instances of significant diagnostic innovation. Well, not all of these are obviously necessarily tests that are good for patients or good for health systems. I think Theranos is obviously the poster child for a claim to diagnostic transformation. It's going to disrupt laboratory diagnostics, to being exposed to what it is, which is largely a fraud. But others where there's more concern, not necessarily just fraudulent behavior as in that case, but other kind of challenges to these tests. And one of the issues with diagnostics is that the process through which they get to patients, through providers and into the health systems, is a different pathway. It is a pathway that moves through statutory regulation with a lower burden of proof for entry. And this is twofold. One is medical device regulation is a risk-based regulatory regime, and most in vitro diagnostics are being assessed as low risk and subjected to fairly low standard of evidentiary proof or none. And the other thing now that's general for medical devices in terms of the risk-based classification, but the thing that's specific to laboratory diagnostics is that there are what's called laboratory developed tests, and these tests completely bypass review by statutory regulators like the Federal Drug Administration, the FDA, or Health Canada. That's been characterized by Pat Sner as a regulatory black hole from a public health and safety perspective. So LDTs are really what that phrase implies, laboratory developed tests. They're tests the lab has put together, the platform technology, the analytes, the algorithm to develop this. There's lots of need for these and value for these. There's lots of tests that complex clinical labs, hospital-based labs provide for their patients, but they can, of course, not just be provided to the patients within the catchment area of that hospital or health system, but marketed and sold. So different statutory regulators have taken a different position on laboratory-developed tests that aren't marketed as a kit and go through statutory regulation, but effectively provided as a service potentially to thousands, hundreds of thousands. So the FDA in the U.S. has been the strongest regulator on this, and they have been clear that they see laboratory-developed tests as falling within their remit. It falls within their statutory oversight. But they've enforced or they've exercised enforcement discretion. And as they put it, historically, laboratory-developed tests were simple, generally available on a limited basis in rare disease genetics. This is all the laboratory testing that gets done is through LDTs. But they see this as having grown so that some LDTs are now much more complex, have a nationwide reach, and present higher risks. So they've intervened on a fairly ad hoc basis. They've sent out warning letters to industry, safety alerts to the public, most recently on an ovarian cancer screening test. But they also moved quite actively to oversee laboratory-developed tests to create a regime that was fairly clear for which types of LDTs would pass a risk threshold such that they needed to be subjected to pre-market review. And they put out guidance for that in 2014, but they have since retreated. So it's not clear that they're going to move. In the EU, we've seen a sort of a different movement, that there is new regulation that's just been passed actually this month that's really going to subject more tests generally to pre-market review, but in principle, in any event, looks to be potentially a significant closure of the laboratory-developed test loophole because those tests developed in a lab, which are marketed on an industrial scale, used within the framework of a commercial diagnostic service, will have to go through pre-market review. Health Canada, leave it at fairly passive on this question. So back to the two example tests that I introduced. Oncotype Dx, importantly, is a laboratory-developed test. Now, the business model for this is that the test is performed in Genomic Health's own lab in California, so samples are sent there. And as they put on their website or through the fine print of the ordering form, the test has not been cleared or approved by the FDA, nor is it required to be. And this is also true of non-invasive prenatal testing. Although the business model is different, many of the companies have licensed out their proprietary kits and software to multiple labs. So within Canada, Ariosa has licensed their kit through Dynacare Labs, and Natera has licensed through Life Labs. But again, these have not been subjected to statutory review. So this raises the question. We have potentially a growth of high cost, highly complex, and high utilization, not just rare disease genetics types of lab tests. And we have a fairly limited role for the statutory regulator in terms of governing what of those tests get into our hands. So does this suggest a growing role for HTA? I'm really just going to pose this as a question. Now, this is the most social scientific of the images that I will present. This is just to suggest that we can helpfully think about the role of various statutory or regulatory actors on the demand side: coverage, pricing, HTA, statutory regulation on market access, and I won't talk about lab licensing, but that's a very important player here, as all being in the space of governing to some degree the adoption of these technologies and influencing their access or how they get to patients. And potentially, if market access regulation is playing less of a role, perhaps HTA is stepping up, at least in part. So this is my last substantive slide. This is just to suggest we have seen some potentially growing interest. The UK program, the NICE Diagnostic Assessment Program, is a significant player. I've noted here the number of tests that are in vitro diagnostics, because I've talked about diagnostics, but I've actually focused on in vitro diagnostics, and of course there are others, but the UK's program does suggest that emphasis is perhaps not misplaced, since the IVDs have been dominant. Québec has a very interesting new committee that François will talk about. Ontario has had several versions of an effort at this at a new Ontario Genetic Advisory Committee that Irfan will talk about. And so I pose the question that my colleagues will potentially answer, and then hopefully we can discuss as to whether there is this growing role. And I'll close by just thanking the authors, Stuart Hogarth from Cambridge, Kelly Holloway from U of T, and the wider team of colleagues working with me on the CIHR-funded study on these issues. Thank you.
So thank you, Fiona, for this introduction. Start my time counter. Okay. So I've been asked to talk to you about the process that's been implemented in Quebec to oversee introduction of new diagnostic tests, whatever the discipline, pathology, microbiology, ethics, biochemistry, or hematology, in the public healthcare system. So I have a couple of introductory slides, and then we'll get into how we do that business back. In terms of interest, I have a Genome Canada grant on comparative effectiveness of non-invasive prenatal testing. So we have mandatory co-funders from industry that are arm's length from that work, but otherwise I don't have any other conflict. In Canada, there are not so many published statistics of what it looks like, so I put together this slide. We have a population of 35 million in 2013. About 700 million diagnostic tests, excluding imaging, are performed every year in Canada, and the cost of that is probably between $3 and $4 billion. The cost per capita of lab tests is the lowest in Quebec, around $80 per capita, and is higher, and sometimes almost a double of that in certain other provinces who have hired private labs to do part of the work, essentially. You've probably seen also that clinical lab tests are involved in 70% of decisions about patients, so they're pretty useful. What does it take to have a test that works? First, it must measure what it's supposed to measure. If I pretend measuring glucose, I must measure that and not something else. This is called analytical validity. The test must also correctly reflect the patient's status and help classify them as affected or not. So this is called clinical validity. And the classification of patients must lead to improved health outcomes. So there's no use performing a test if you're not using this information to improve the patient outcomes. This is called clinical utility, and it has not to be confounded with clinical usefulness. And sometimes there is confusion about this. Of course, you must be able to pay yourself the test. As Fiona mentioned, the Oncotype Dx test costs 40% of the total budget for tests that are sent outside of the Quebec province. So it's the most expensive out of the province tests. And of course, the test must be socially acceptable. So since 2012, the Quebec government has put together this process of validating the relevance and utility and validity of those tests that were proposed by hospitals to be implemented in the system. Before that, it was more or less the free-for-all and the first-come, first-served basis. And we were seeing tests popping here and there, and people were billing themselves for the test, etc. And this was all abolished in 2012. Essentially, when the application for introducing new tests still have to come from hospitals. Usually these are university hospitals because those are the hospitals that are performing a highly specialized test. And those applications are sent to the Ministry of Health, who sends all of them to the INES committee. And there's a staff of 10 full-time equivalents that are performing HTA reviews for every test which is applied for. I will show you a little more details about this process. So there's a standard form that has to be filled by the applicant. It has to provide details on the test identification, its intended use, details on the provider, who will be responsible for the test, what's the trajectory of the test. You must not be sending your sample to a university lab to do part of the testing. You have to control all the trajectory of the sample. It has to be 100% clinical grade. What's the evidence base for the usefulness of the test, for its clinical utility and validity? What's the quality control plan? And because external quality control in proficiency testing is a mandatory aspect of clinical testing, and I could just point out that there's no such XTQA available for a lot of LDT tests that are even in the private industry. And of course, what's the expected clinical need? Are we expecting 100 tests per year or 10,000 for the Quebec province? So the evaluation step looks into all those elements that I just mentioned. So benefits for the health in terms of outcomes, clinical utility, clinical validity, analytical validity, and other issues that have to be looked upon. The details are on the INES website, unfortunately in French, but in fact you can get all those elements from, we didn't invent this system. It's a framework which has been published more in several different places, including the CDC. There's a CDC subgroup on genomics that has been also using the same dimensions and defining them specifically for genomic applications. We also published with the International Federation of Clinical Chemistry and Lab Medicine, which includes 78 countries, a framework that has been also identified by CADTH as being one of the most comprehensive, because it also looks at other factors than those 4 dimensions. I won't go into the details for them. Finally, once the reviews have been made by the staff of INES, they get help from experts in the field, of course, and they put together an HTA review of the tests. And this is brought to an expert scientific committee, which is comprised of representative of all the disciplines of lab medicine, also pediatrician and etician, and also representative of the general public. And those recommendations of either introducing the test or not introducing, or introducing under certain conditions, are then sent to the Ministry of Health, who can decide if we go for it or not, and who will also decide which lab will be doing tests in the province. Usually only one lab will perform it. And fortunately for everyone, all those recommendations and the complete file are put online at the time of the recommendation. Consult those documents. And since 2012, we've dealt with now close to 120 different tests And you have the scores here, the distribution by discipline, and roughly the acceptance rate varies between 40 and 70%, and even 100% now. And so this is how things are going, and it's pretty efficient way of producing those evidence. Usually the time it takes since the consultation from the ministry to the recommendations is within 6 months. A few words about LDT. So, and it is, with respect to the validity of the test to measure what's supposed to measure, of course, for lab-developed tests, we don't have this information. Usually it's proprietary, it's not published. The lab put together the reagents and do the testing, as if you were doing that in your basement, for instance. So it's not a very solid ground, even to evaluate the test, and it's a challenge even to do the HTA evaluation. The validation across labs is not the same. So from a lab to lab, some labs will validate a test with 5 samples, others with 5,000 samples. And there's no rule, or supposedly no rule. Usually there's no proficiency testing, I've mentioned it, and you cannot assume the same performance or the performance that is published for all the labs which will develop the test, because the way they implement the test, the reagent they use, the controls they use, the methods and the machines they use, all those things are not standardized across labs. There are guidelines to do that. The only problem is that they're not very specific on the numbers, and they usually left to the lab the liberty to decide how many samples they want to test. It's usually mentioned a reasonable number of samples. So specific. You could do statistics and say be below that number. You can't be confident into numbers. Analytical validation was just a line, or almost, in what I presented up to now, but you can just see here that it has to look after a lot of different dimensions of the laboratory testing phase. And I won't go into the details, but just to show you that it's not trivial. Of course, clinical validity is another condition, and it totally relies on the capacity of the test to measure what it's supposed to measure. So it's all building on the basis of the analytical validity of the test, but it has to be demonstrated. Even if you can measure, for instance, color of the eyes very precisely, it may not have any clinical use. Clinical utility is the same. Even if the test result is associated with a patient condition, if you cannot improve the health outcomes, or the efficiency of the healthcare system around that condition, it may not be useful to spend a lot of resources on the test. There are standards for reporting diagnostic accuracy studies. There's even an updated standard, the STAR standard in 2015. Unfortunately, out of the 30 essential items that should be placed into each paper, the mean number of those items is 12. So most of the literature is not very solid. Some groups have also looked into the reliability of the clinical ability of certain tests that are developed in the molecular diagnostic field, for instance, and they've concluded in red that the results show that there's necessity to be very cautious in interpreting the diagnostic studies in molecular research. So everyone is looking at the beast from a different angle. We have to look at a lot of different elements, and we cannot only rely on 1 or 2 or 3 to make the decisions. And this is just to illustrate fact. So as a conclusion slide, I would just remind you a couple of the challenges that we have in medicine, but also in lab medicine. Limited resources for healthcare, so unless we agree to increase our income taxes, we'll have to make choices. Want to introduce a very expensive method, you have to remove funding from somewhere else in the system. There's rapidly increasing knowledge about disease and biology, especially in the area of genomics, and the capacity we now have to look at millions of proteins at the same time, millions of DNA fragments at the same time, millions of metabolites at the same time. So we have a lot of technical capacity, but we need to do the work right. Cost of certain treatments and interventions are also increasing, and there's also different paradigms which are being introduced to mitigate those costs or to choose the patients which would benefit or not from those costs. Of course, all this conditional on the test fulfilling what we expect it to fulfill. Technologies are rapidly changing, so even if you validate something in 1 year in terms of genomics, it changes so rapidly that you may need to redo the analysis. And unfortunately, there's very little research funding to validate diagnostic tests. It's not as sexy as finding new genes, but you have to do the work downstream. And the investment curve is similar to that for drugs. And the amount of money you have to put into discovery a new drug and validating it in large-scale studies is orders of magnitude. So I will stop here by just using as a thank you slide the evidence-based lab medicine cycle, and I will get the next speaker. Thank you. We'll have questions later.
So first of all, I just want to say thanks to Fiona for organizing this panel. I looked at Francois and Fiona's slides again this morning, and I really don't want to repeat a lot of what they have said, and I think the value in these sessions often comes from the discussion, so I'm going to fly through my slides, just tell you a little bit about Health Quality Ontario and what we do in this space, and then maybe offer a few personal comments. So for those of you who don't know about Health Quality Ontario, we're a provincial agency in Ontario established by a piece of legislation called the Excellent Care for All Act, and there are 3 key components of our mandate: promoting healthcare that is supported by the best available evidence, supporting quality improvement, and monitoring and reporting to the people of Ontario. We do this by using the best scientific methods we can and by engaging with patients and partners in the healthcare system. I put this slide up here in the context of the diagnostic test session, just to sort of maybe a little bit of a reminder that, often the focus is on bringing diagnostic tests into the system, and Francois alluded to this, especially in the last slide, really what we want to do is make sure the right tests are used in the right patients at the right time and also interpreted in the right way. Francois also had that slide from the National Academy of Sciences Institute of Medicine report, and I am a practicing physician, and I get the bulletin from our Malpractice Protection Association each month, and I'm reminded how misdiagnosis is a very big issue in quality of healthcare, and it's probably one that we have ignored a little bit. We do health technology assessment, the sort of same way I think that most health technology assessment agencies do health technology assessment. Obviously, we're trying to improve our methods continually. One thing I did want to talk about, and again, this maybe repeats a little bit of what Francois talked about in terms of the difference between utility and usefulness. And one way to elucidate that difference, I think, is to speak with patients. So there are many diagnostic tests that don't, or prognostic tests that don't translate obviously into an improvement in a measurable health outcome. So there may be no gain in life years or no gain in quality adjusted life years, but it is still very important for a patient to have that test. And maybe the classic example that comes to mind is a child who is born with a genetic condition or some sort of rare developmental disorder where knowing what the diagnosis is will not actually help the child live any longer, may not result in any different treatment being provided, but having spoken to families who have children and who with rare conditions like this and have had that diagnosis, the value that those families place on knowing what the diagnosis is large. And I'm not sure, in theory, probably the economists in the room could figure out a way to calculate a utility and do a cost-effectiveness analysis, but it's not easy, I will say that. Like with UNES, we have a expert committee at arm's length to the organization that reviews the health technology assessments that are produced by our staff and then makes recommendations about whether these tests should be publicly funded or not. And then we now have a subcommittee of OHTAC, the Ontario Health Technology Advisory Committee, which will focus particularly on genetic tests. Francois and Fiona also made this point, that genetic tests are not the only diagnostic tests, right? And actually, I was thinking this morning, as somebody who still practices some general internal medicine and is now 14 years out of medical school, what genetic tests have changed, or what tests, diagnostic tests, have changed in my own clinical practice over the 14 years that I've been in practice. And actually, I think probably the diagnostic test that has changed my practice the most is ultrasound. We used to put needles into patients without ultrasound. Now we do it with ultrasound guidance, because we can move the ultrasound out of the ultrasound lab and to the bedside. Obviously, there are some patients who, particularly patients who are newly diagnosed with cancer, who get a genetic test to guide their treatment. But I'm with Fiona in that I'm a little bit skeptical that we will all have our genome as part of our health record before this decade is out. OHTAC now makes very clear recommendations about whether a particular test or treatment or device should be publicly funded or not, and then we explain OHTAC's reasons for the recommendation, and we publish that report with an associated health technology assessment report. And so this is just a list of the tests that we have reviewed in the last couple of years. It says diagnostic tests, but these are not all actually diagnostic tests. Some of them are for prognosis. And as you can see, there's huge variety. Fiona alluded to the changing landscape in Ontario with respect to genetic tests. So this is a relatively new mandate for us, and we anticipate over the next few years that we will be looking at more genetic tests. The one at the bottom was a pharmacogenetic test for depression that we did for a government committee, so we didn't make the recommendation ourselves, but in the future when we do health technology assessments of genetic tests, we will be making the recommendation. So a couple of closing thoughts. One is that I think we share this goal of facilitating rapid access to diagnostic tests that work and that provide value to the patient and provide some reasonable value for money. And I think Fiona's slide on the costs of what tests were like 15 or 20 years ago compared to what the costs of some tests are like now was an important one. And of course, as a society, we look forward to those test costs coming down, I think. And the other point, I guess, and I'm reiterating a point I made with my first slide here, is that it's not just about bringing the test into the system and putting it on some formulary or making it so that now people have access to out-of-province funding or in-province funding or whatever. It really is about developing a cohesive system so that patients and clinicians can make the right choices about what tests to use and how to interpret them so that they can improve health for our patients. Stop there. Very much.
I'm going to lower the mic again. I have a habit of following the very tallest people on our panel. So I'm happy to be here this afternoon talking about diagnostics. So I've been at CADTH for a dozen years, and I'm not going to share with you a full dozen years worth of experience, but I'll make sure that you get a sense of sort of the sporadic nature of the requests that have come to us, as well as sharing some of the challenges that I've seen, either being in the seat of leading a medical device program at CADTH with an expert committee that offers recommendations on all sorts of non-drug technologies. Testing, whether through imaging or genetics, is just one of the possibilities for that committee, as well as a chief scientist and sort of the methodology that goes into this. And then finally, to support what Irfan just said, I think the huge challenge that faces our system is not about doing the HTA in and of itself. It's about all the things around in the system that need to be there in order to support accurate implementation of these, and of course optimal patient. So disclosure slide, I think I was one of the people who suggested we include disclosure slides here, and I see Michelle Majumdar in the audience as well. So take it for what it's worth. I've been at CADTH for 12 years. I'm also an adjunct professor at U of O, and I don't think I have anything further to declare other than, of course, I'm a Sens fan. I think it's helpful just to remind us about what HTA has been defined as, and I have a couple of slides that speak to this, and I've put them here intentionally because I think it helps to ground us when we recognize that HTA exists not as an academic endeavor, but to support policy and other decisions. So again, we're there in service of a system. We don't have the luxury of spending 2 years working on an assessment to get it right. If a decision needs to be made out there in the system, it's going to be made, whether or not that perfect HTA exists. So that's sort of in the backdrop of the work that we do, that need for timely provision of evidence to support those decisions. So that's going to be part of the challenge slides that I get to a little later on. Of course, we're looking at not just the clinical or the medical, but the social and the ethical and the implementation issues associated with a particular technology. And of course, in the diagnostic space, I mean, you can certainly appreciate, given the examples that have been shown so far, non-invasive prenatal testing certainly comes with it, not just that clinical element of, does this work? Can we accurately diagnose things? It's all of the sort of knock-on effects of that diagnosis. A second definition of HTA, and this one comes from the International Society of HTA, and I've emphasized a few words in this definition because I want us to also recognize it's not just about the direct and intended consequences of a technology, but we're hoping for HTA to also look at the indirect and, of course, the unintended consequences that go on with the decision to adopt or perhaps not to adopt a particular technology. So again, that complicates matters. So you've heard a lot about CADTH, and I probably don't need to go into this other than to say we do a whole lot of assessments, but as you might not know, on the non-drug side of the equation, there really isn't no formal mandate to do HTA of non-drug technologies, and so this will lead into yet another challenge that I'm going to share with you in terms of just with so many technologies out there currently on our market, tens of thousands in fact, and thousands more coming onto our system or hoping to join our system each year, how can HTA collectively be able to kind of have a concerted effort to have that impact that we're hoping for? How do you choose which things get assessed? How do you choose which things get reassessed? And certainly this is going to speak to the importance of having good connections with our fellow HTA colleagues across the country and in fact globally to ensure that we're able to be tackling those technologies at the right time. So just to share with you a slide that covers our programs and services at CADTH. So you're likely very familiar with our 2 drug reimbursement programs, the Common Drug Review and our Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review. And of course, I do have a slide in a moment that speaks to the increasing number of companion diagnostics that are coming along with the submissions to these 2 formulary programs. The next batch of programs falls into our health technology management bucket. So these are our non-formulary review programs, and this is where we have seen, in fact, the greatest number of reports being done in the diagnostic space, so both in terms of medical imaging as well as your predictive and diagnostic genetic testing. That can be through our rapid response service. So the rapid response service has been in existence for 12 years as well, and over that 12 years, we've provided about, I'm looking at Chris Campbell in the background, close to 4,000 reports over that time. So these are individually initiated requests from anyone working in the Canadian healthcare system who needs help, who needs evidence to support a policy or practice decision. And as I'll get to in a few slides, you'll see that the majority of the requests in the diagnostic space have come through the Rapid Response Program. We're thrilled that the Rapid Response Program has been there to support those requests, but it does speak to the fact that we're getting these one-off requests coming in through the system in perhaps an uncoordinated fashion. So that's another challenge to think about. We also do sort of traditional health technology assessments, and then those HTAs that go to our expert committee, which Sterling Bryan has affectionately referred to as well. It's called HTERP. I think he's not too pleased with that acronym, but the Health Technology Expert Review Panel. So it is the one expert committee that services all of CADTH's non-drug work. So this is a little, it's analogous to OHTAC with Health Quality Ontario, but that we don't have a subcommittee that deals specifically with imaging and genetic and genomic testing. So this sort of one committee deals with whatever might come to it. That being said, we've learned that we have a core group of members with that particular committee. So that will be your economist, your ethicist, your public member, clinicians, and a methodologist. And then depending on whatever request is coming to the table, we will add people to the table. So we do have people who are content experts joining in that table, but it's not a separate committee per se. We also do environmental scanning and horizon scanning. So the environmental scanning gets at who's doing what right now. So in Canada, sometimes you need another group of people to find out who's doing what, even your next door neighbor. We might not want to talk and share. So we're happy to do those environmental scans, and then horizon scanning about what's coming so that we can hopefully get ahead of the curve. I should also mention our scientific advice program, which was launched a couple of years ago. This is a fee-for-service program that gives advice to pharmaceutical companies at this point in time about their drug development plan. So what kind of outcomes should we be looking at, what sample size, and so on. We have received submissions through that program. 2 out of 6 so far have involved a companion diagnostic. So sort of the diagnostic stuff is percolating in CADTH in all different elements of the agency. So I'm just making reference to this. This is up on the CADTH website, and I've given you the web link there at the bottom. This is CADTH's proposed process for the assessment of companion diagnostics. So again, for those who are submitting dossiers to either the Common Drug Review or the Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review, we've now outlined a proposed process for how to deal with that companion diagnostic element. So similar to what Irfan presented in terms of what HQO has looked at in the past couple of years around diagnostics, we've also taken a look at what we've done, and I have a few slides. Chris, with apologies to you, didn't list all the ones through rapid response because it would take probably from now until 2:30 to get through those. But I do want to again let you know that this is coming up. It is something that we're seeing, but again, it's still kind of a hit and miss. Some of the requests that we're getting don't necessarily deal with the test per se, but perhaps an approach. So you'll see a few references to point of care testing. And in fact, that fits with, I think, a lot of people's desire to get care delivered closer to home and out in the community. So how can point of care testing help with that? We're currently working, you'll notice the first bullet under the environmental scans is to actually do an environmental scan about point of care testing. So how are our systems handling this? Who's doing what? What are the guidelines in place? Because again, there is a real desire from the system to get a good handle on this. For the larger reports, so the health technology assessment reports, and then those that are classified as optimal use, so optimal use meaning it goes to our expert committee, you'll get a flavor for, these ones are just, these are not the imaging related requests that we've been able to deal with. So you'll see the first one being on ESR and CRP testing, and a little birdie has told me that perhaps this is a subject that has been flagged for potential disinvestment in one of the provinces that is considering implementing a disinvestment or reassessment program. Sorry, I can't get that bad word out of my vocabulary. In terms of the optimal use, you'll see the variety there. So HPV testing is one that we've just kicked off. Then looking at things like mismatch repair deficiency or DMMR testing for colorectal cancer patients. point-of-care troponin for diagnosing MI in the emergency department, and then point-of-care INR. So it's not just in the oncology space. We're seeing it kind of everywhere, but again, it's coming in not a coordinated fashion. I've mentioned both the scientific advice. So 1/3 of the submissions we've received to date have involved a companion diagnostic, and a similar figure, so 30% of submissions to PCODER since sort of its inception until the end of the past fiscal year have had an associated companion diagnostic. And again, rapid response, quite a few of those reports have been in that space. I should also mention, and this probably isn't a beautiful slide, but CADTH has been the secretariat to a group that's called the Policy Forum. And so this is a group of federal, provincial, and territorial policy people who get together at regular intervals to discuss policy issues. And a number of years ago, they had flagged this issue around personalized medicine being an issue that needed to get attention. They discussed it in terms of being a burning platform. We need to get ahead of this. And I went back in my inbox, and I think this goes back a lot of years. This slide in particular is 2015, but that's when we actually got people together to hold a meeting. And I'm looking at Nicole in the back because she's been there since the beginning on this too. So we held a meeting a couple of years ago about this, and we were hoping for it to kind of, go up the flagpole, if you will, the proverbial flagpole, if you will, to get people to understand, like, this is, maybe it's not even coming, maybe it's already here. We need to get some sort of mechanism around this in order to be able to handle this. So again, if people want to go and look at the proceedings from this particular meeting, I've given you the web link there. Also, in support of the Policy Forum activities in this space, we engaged with Fiona's colleague, Stuart Hogarth, to actually give us a typology, because we recognized that a lot of us were using similar words, but not always the same words. Did we mean the same thing? So here we do have on the CADTH website a typology in order to help, further this discussion. So if we're using consistent nomenclature, maybe that can help. I also want to mention the fact that CADTH is a subscriber to ECRI-Gene. So ECRI-Gene is a service that's provided by ECRI, a US-based enterprise. ECRI does a lot of wonderful work. Unfortunately, it's hidden from most people's eyes because you need to subscribe in order to get at their information. So CADTH subscribes to ECRI and ECRI-Gene in order to be able to get a hold of some very valuable information that we then hope to be able to share with others. ECRI has recognized the importance of getting ahead of this curve, or maybe we're not even ahead of it anymore. Maybe it's just getting on, the train that's left the station, in order to start capturing data on all of the things that Francois mentioned, analytic validity and utility. And so we're hoping to be able to populate this in partnership with ECRI, again, as a resource for people so they don't have to go and reinvent the wheel by doing their own assessments from scratch. So challenge number one, I've already alluded to this, is just the volume of tests that are here and that are coming. We sort of see potential for exponential growth, particularly when you consider the LDTs that Francois was mentioning. And so again, as an HTA body where we have a limited, funding in order to deliver on reports or assessments around diagnostic imaging, around genetic testing, around defibrillators, around models of care, plus reassessments, how do we manage this volume? Another challenge is, and again, I'm not going to harp on this, is just the evidence. So when you're looking in the diagnostic testing space, it's different to looking at the effectiveness of a particular, intervention in terms of a traditional, let's say, a drug or a device. So you need people who have a different methodological mindset in order to be able to do this well. In fact, there is evidence out there that has gone and found just how poorly people do in this space. And I'll sort of give a shout out to Matt McInnes, who's a radiologist at the Ottawa Hospital, who's looked at just how poorly meta-analyses are done in the imaging space. It's horrible. It's really horrendous. And so then if you can't even do, that part of your work well, the rest of it is probably going to be built on a bit of a house of cards. Quality, again, I won't go through this because it's been, we could spend a whole other day discussing that, but it's an important element in the space, particularly around the LDTs. And of course, the unintended consequences of when you go and you're looking at things and we might not fully understand what the downstream effects are, in particular around overdiagnosis and overtreatment. And I'll give a plug for my colleagues who are holding the Overdiagnosis Conference in Quebec City in the summer. So this is something that as HTA doers, and we're being true to that definition of HTA, considering the indirect and unintended consequences of this, I think there's going to be an important amount of work for those of you in the implementation space, so that if a committee recommends the use of a particular diagnostic, what else needs to be in place to ensure that people are provided with the best possible care? I'm thinking of genetic counselors. I'm thinking of potential rural and remote and northern issues in terms of being able to access that information. So I just wanted to share this. I mean, this is a topic that is getting a lot of attention. This one was just published a couple of weeks ago, including colleague Sean Tunis, who's involved in HTA in the States. They looked at the body of evidence here, and I've circled the important part. So after doing a review of comparative effectiveness research in genomic medicine, they found a very limited body of evidence about the effect of using these tests on health outcomes and many evidence gaps for CER to address. So definitely more research is needed. And with that, I say thank you.
Moderate, which means I don't have to answer any questions. Fabulous. So do we have any questions in the audience? Oh, there's one. Yes.
Here's a problem of unintended consequences and overdiagnosis. And I wonder about kind of almost what's the possibility of including that in the modeling? Like, how could we have known that all these great ultrasound thyroid cancer, how that could have been now? As opposed to I mean, it's great to say part of the process is guidelines and say incidental.
To try to answer that question, but I think the answer is nobody's really figured it out, right? So, I saw a little bit on Twitter about the overdiagnosis of thyroid cancer, so there must have been a session earlier this morning. But actually, it's a smaller problem, as I understand it, in Canada than it is in the United States. Smaller problem in the United States than it has been in Korea. And if you bring in a test that can diagnose patients, you will, of course, have some false positives, or what is essentially a false. I guess, overdiagnosis, maybe it's not technically a false positive, but effectively it's the same sort of thing. And short of linking the introduction of tests with guidelines, standards, quality improvement supports, monitoring and reporting, and empowering patients and educating the public about the utility, I don't have a great answer, but all of that stuff hasn't really worked so great for a lot of the overdiagnosis that's happened to date. And I know that the overdiagnosis stuff has become really big movement over the last few years, and rightly so. But this is happening at the same time as we still have hugely problematic underdiagnosis. So we still see lots and lots of patients who have advanced chronic obstructive lung disease, for example, and have never had a pulmonary function test, or asthma and have never. I'm trying to think of other examples of underdiagnosis. Maybe imaging is in my mind, but there's still also a lot of undetected and untreated or undertreated problems out there. Right patient, right time.
Go ahead.
I think, Irfan, you hit it on the head, though, by saying that HTA shouldn't just be looked at as sort of this one-off. It needs to be connected in terms of, quality standards and collection of data that can then feed back so that if we do recognize there's a problem, we can maybe act on it before the good old 17-year time lag between other things. So, again, I think there's no easy answer, but just think of it in terms of that interconnected system. And then I would also say making sure that we've engaged people. So again, it's not an academic exercise with, either us in Toronto or Ottawa working, independently based on what we find in the literature, but reaching out to patients and clinicians to kind of understand what this could look like, what are the patient values, and ensuring that that's part of the process, the research question, in fact, before we kind of go on madly in a particular direction. But yeah, if you can figure that out, or if someone wants a PhD or a postdoc topic, I think you could be busy for quite some time.
I could add also that it's a really good question, and it's difficult to capture those dimensions in a trial, even a real-life trial, or even in a pilot of starting a technology. So I think we have to get much better at following up on what happens after a technology is used. There are ways to do that. This has access to clinical data with other types of data within the system and doing follow-up studies. So one way to approach this would be to, when you fund the introduction of a new technology, you should probably also fund the work of following up what are its consequences, and not only for 6 months, but perhaps for a longer period, so you can have some feedback process and re-evaluation of what's going on and how the technology is used. Are there unintended uses? Are there underuses or overuses? This should pop out if you look after it, but unless you look for it, you won't see it until it's much later.
BBC. So Genome Canada is about to invest a huge amount of money into developing or helping develop evidence for even more tests and markers. And I think in some ways they're quite innovative in terms of that requiring the health economic aspect into those grants, but without a clear guidance of how these are going to be assessed in the future, still seems to be some sort of ambiguity about actually does cost really matter. So I'm just wondering, are you kind of giving any sort of feedback or signals to Canada or people at this stage that actually, guys can't be developing expensive tests and assume that they're going to be, that sense that ambiguity is going to potentially leave us, with difficult situations where a demand for even more sort of.
I'm happy to answer that one, Nick. So I've been engaged with Genome Canada for the past few years because I think they've recognized the importance of engaging the HTA community in this work. So I think Genome Canada has recognized it. I'm not so sure that some of the Genome Canada funded investigators enjoy us being there. All to say, though, that there is that sort of sentiment coming from that funding council level to say, you need to include, a health economist as part of your team. And in fact, there is now a desire to have even more engagement. I don't know what it will look like exactly, and we're still sort of discussing through it whether HTA might sit on a particular committee that's looking at this, but Genome Canada wants to make sure that their investment is actually going to make a difference, years down the road. And so I think they've recognized the importance of, we need to invest in things where there's a need and, where the evidence is going to be collected, the right evidence, and that is going to include some assessment of value. I think the hope is also that we will be able to bring a sense around implementation. So again, similar to so many HTAs and HTRs that are done, there's that implementation wall. So again, how do we make sure that all the good work that's being funded and developed, if it actually, is worthwhile, we can get it into the system and recognize the benefit of that. So I don't have specifics, but just to say that Genome Canada, CIHR, and CADTH have been having those discussions because they do want this opportunity to be, with a view towards that value proposition. Yeah.
I'm well pleased also to discuss this because I'm in the process of writing a grant. And so I read very carefully the RFA. But one of the problems that has been, there have been meetings between Genome Canada and users, et cetera, to try to focus or identify how to do that. The problem is this 17-year cycle. And unless you really have a blockbuster diagnostic such as an IP, with overwhelming performance as compared to the current standard. And even then, it's not obvious, and not everyone will believe what's published and funded by industry. So unless you have such products, you need to fund the development and initial validation of the thing. You need to fund the clinical validation of the application, and then you need to fund the economic work and implementation tools, et cetera. So it's difficult within a single 4-year project to have all those components of the train together simultaneously, unless you pick something which is very far down the stream of almost initial application or already commercially available in the States and not in Canada. This was the status of the NIPT when we got our Genome Canada grant on that topic in 2013. So. But a lot of projects are much more upstream than that, and you have to do that work as well. But to demand that those applications are implemented within 2 years of the end of the project is not really realistic. And the funding team cannot have a project that is longer than 48 months. So you can have a 1-year extension in the end, but not more. So it's a difficult one, and I think you will end up with projects which are some of them upstream, some of them middle stream, and some of them downstream. And the other component is that there's a mandatory GELD with 3 E's component to the project, but it's not. It can be very small, and there can be a lot of other science than the economic, social, and ethical HTA components. And there are very little large-scale such projects which include all those components right at the start. In the last competition, out of the 17 projects funded, there were only 2 which were large-scale projects, and all the others had very minor components which are essential for the HTA. So I think it's a good question, and I think people at Genome Canada are aware of that. CIHR as a partner, and I'll be short, are also interestingly apparently aware of that as well, because to get the CIHR component of the next wave of such project, you cannot use genomic centers. You need to use a public lab to do the test you want to do. So they're bidding that you will need to be studying something which is already very close or implemented at the time of the research project. So it forces the team to work very close to implementation, and probably increases the chances that you will generate evidence that is useful for the decision downstream.
Sullivan, Toronto. So maybe I can put the question to you first, but I'd be interested in the panel's reaction. You mentioned that lab testing in Quebec is cheaper for conventional tests, and I want to talk a little bit more about the conventional tests than the new kind of flood of genetic tests that are coming in. But do we have any concept about what the differences are between provinces in Canada on what people are spending for laboratory tests? And I spent a bit of time doing a review in Ontario to find out that we spend something close to $1 billion. We have zero utilization management, and there are a few other issues. But and there's this untidy reality of separating laboratory tests that are done in a hospital with research-related tests and diagnostics. Presumably, there's genomic initiatives going to be driving, and the kind of all the sunk costs that we've got there now. So it would be interesting, again, in the context of an HTA discussion, to talk about what is the value proposition for these tests. You know, in Ontario and BC, we have vast majority of tests are done in the community sector, and we have no idea what they actually cost. We know what we pay, but we have no idea of the cost. So is there any appetite, you guys seem to be pursuing this area, to take a look at this more broadly? Life career, but I'm interested in your thoughts on this, and all the payers will be interested in it.
I, of course, would have a very large appetite for this. I've looked, when I asked myself this question 6 years ago, the moment of the Quebec government starting to think about consolidating the labs, all the 500 labs in Quebec to 11 labs, and thinking that it would save tons of money, half of the job. So we wondered what was the cost per capita in Quebec. So I looked around, and there was a study commissioned by the BC government in 2002. And they did a fairly serious effort of comparing the things, but again, province from province, difficult to get the data. And they didn't have data from Quebec. We had those from the Quebec statistics. So we know exactly, all the labs are public almost, and we know how many glucose tests were done in this hospital and this hospital, and for every test, for every site of testing in the province. So we know the exact number. We all know also the exact expenses, and we can add to that salaries of the physicians who oversee those tests. So we can have an interesting, at least comparable figure, but it's really an issue. It's difficult to get those figures, and I haven't seen anything since then. So it's 15 years down the road now. I think it would be a very timely thing to do, and it will ask for some work, because to gather this information from each province is a challenge, but it would be very interesting. And we have different funding models in the provinces. We know that Quebec has been almost dogmatically, if it's a word in English, wanting only public funding of those tests, and those tests being done in the public healthcare system. So the cost is the cost of the test, essentially, plus some management percentage. So it's fairly reflective of the real cost the hospitals report to the government in terms of their lab activities, and there's roughly no other activities whatsoever apart a little commercial offers some tests which are available. So we have the luxury of probably more easily figuring out the real cost of. We haven't seen through comparative study across the country, and I think it would be very timely.
Yes. So first of all, I'm not confident of all that much in the world, but I am confident, Terry, that you know more about this topic than I do. And I guess the second thing I would say is this is where we sometimes get to take a little bit of a purist or almost academic perspective at Health Quality Ontario and say we're not the payer, right? Our job is to make recommendations about what should be introduced into the system and then support the usage of those tests in the right way. And then we leave it to folks like you and our colleagues at the ministry to help make sure that the management and the infrastructure and the payment model, and whether it's truly competitive or quasi-competitive, that sort of stuff happens. And I had the pleasure of reading your report, and there are obviously a lot of really thoughtful recommendations in there, and I'm not sure how many have sort of been implemented yet. You might know. So hopefully.
Great presentations. Thank you so much. And just to pick up on Irfan's most recent comment and something you've put up on your slide deck. So my curiosity, and this is an overarching curiosity, I'll probably take a day to kind of unpack this, but really interesting to see you had a list of tests that you had an HTA done on, and you had a series of yes or no recommendations against them. Do you have a sense of how many of those actually shifted to practice? And an overarching question to all of you then would be, in the ideal world situation, the HTA doers, how do you optimize that use of that recommendation that you come up with so that these tests, these recommendations actually move into practice and we get to optimize the benefit of all this wonderful work that you're producing?
So the first question is the ministry accepts the vast majority of tax recommendations. There's often a bit of a time lag, and since those were pretty recent recommendations in the queue, so to speak, but they do. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it gets to every patient who might benefit from that test, or to the earlier questioner, that it doesn't result in overuse and overdiagnosis. That is a harder question.
For Quebec, we have similar, the government usually accepts the recommendation, but again, there's a lag in terms of choosing who will do the test, because everyone is crying for it, and then how they will pay for it if it cannot be funded through the current budget of the lab. So this is partly one of the explanations we have for all those consolidation efforts to liberate funds that we can pay for other tests. But usually the budget impact analysis are not so optimistic. Less than 600 million in terms of lab tests, doing the tests. So usually, and one problem that we face when we want to implement, and if we have to pull the budget from another silo of the system. So if you're preventing or shortening the hospital stay because you're testing for a virus, and you can have the answer in 2 hours instead of 48 hours, to remove budget from the different areas of the hospital which would benefit from implementing that test is very difficult, because as you know, every time a dollar frees up in the system, it disappears for another need, and it's not really presented to the lab with a check saying, here's $400, $1,000 that we saved last year because of your new test.
And I'd have to say for us at CADTH, I mean, the work that we undertake is always in response to a request that we've received from the system. And so for the rapid responses, these are, one-offs. Again, that work always ends up on our website, and we do find that just because one person had the question, many others were actually wanting to ask that same question. So we do know then that the reach of that individual report goes further than that one requester. For the big reports, we always make sure that we've got multiple jurisdictions on board. So if it's going to go to our expert committee, we need the majority of the country to say, yes, we want you to do this report, and we're going to use it. What does use it mean? It might mean we looked at it, we liked it, but it's not the right time. And so I think it is a challenge for all of us in this space. Is just you've asked us to do this. We've done it. We've engaged the right people. So for us, again, it's engaging anyone who could be affected by that recommendation, whether it's a yay or a nay. So people who could gain, people who could lose, the patients as well. But I do think that collectively as an HTA community, we need to do a lot better about spread. So again, if Ontario is doing work and making a recommendation, I know it might not look the same when it gets implemented in PEI, but for goodness sake, I mean, with all these technologies to look at, we shouldn't be kind of doing the same work 3 months, out of sync. So I'd say that, could be a lifetime's worth of work for us. But again, you do just need to make sure that you've got the right people at the table, and they then can champion that back in their home community.
Thanks. Please allow you to join.
Very nice to meet you. Yeah, I mean, I've heard you on the phone a lot, but I've never had a chance to meet you in person.